I think you got him. Yeah, he's dead.
Hello everybody. In today's true crime story, we're going to be talking about Mark Essex. He was the New Orleans sniper. He killed a total of 9 people and wounded a ton of other people in 2 separate attacks. This was one of the most prolific attacks that ever happened in New Orleans. Mark Essex was born in Emporia, Kansas on August 12th, 1949. He was the second of 5 children born to Mark and Nellie Essex. Their kids were raised in a religious household, and Mark and Nellie were very close to all their children. His father worked in a meatpacking plant, and his mother worked with disadvantaged children as a counselor. As Mark grew up, he enjoyed being a Boy Scout and loved music. He played the saxophone in high school and enjoyed hunting and fishing as well. His aspirations when he got older was to become a minister. He was considered very popular among his peers. He was always the guy that was nice to everybody. He enjoyed hanging out with anyone that he could. He was constantly making new friends. He also dated girls of all races, and the only reason I bring up race in this is because it actually plays a very big role in this whole story today. Mark was a great kid. He never got in trouble growing up. The only time he ever really had any encounters with the police was when they pulled him over for driving when they thought he was too young to drive. He was of age to drive, but he was only 5'4", so he was kind of a small guy, and the police pulled him over thinking that he was underage and driving. That was Mark's very first encounter with the police, and it was basically profiling. So, not a great start, I guess. Mark graduated high school in 1967. He did a quick semester of college, but decided to drop out and pursue something different. He started working in the same meatpacking plant as his father, and that's where he discovered that he truly wanted his life to go in a different direction. So he actually enlisted in the Navy. He joined the Navy on January 13th, 1969 at the age of 19. During this time, his parents, Mark and Nellie, said that he was a happy-go-lucky kid. He never had any issues. He was super bright, and he was very friendly to everyone that he encountered. Mark Essex was assigned to the Naval Air Station at Imperial Beach, California. He passed his initial training with high esteem for all of his superiors. They recommended that he enroll into the Naval Dental Program. He was a technician specializing in endodontics and periodontics. As his naval career progressed, Mark started noticing a lot of racism coming from the white service members towards the black service members. Within his first year of his naval service, Mark took a job as a bartender at an enlisted men's club named Jolly Roaders. There, Mark discovered that certain rooms were actually off limits to black people. Mark wrote a letter to his mother and discussed all of the racism that he was experiencing within the Navy. He expressed concern and said that the Navy wasn't exactly what he thought it was going to be. Throughout his first year in the Navy, he had risen through the ranks and was now a seaman, but he was still being harassed on a daily basis. Mark began taking sedatives to help him sleep and ease some of the tension that he felt while he was in the Navy. Mark then became very close friends with a black colleague named Rodney Frank. Rodney described himself as a black militant. They would actually spend a lot of their free time hanging out together, discussing all the racism that they've experienced throughout the Navy. By the summer of 1970, both Mark and Rodney became radicalized. Rodney encouraged Mark to read literature that was written by the founders of the Black Panther Party. By August of 1970, both Mark and Rodney were overcome with their rage. They were both so upset about the racism that they were seeing in the Navy that they just became even more radicalized. All of this led to Mark getting into a physical altercation with an NCO, which is a non-commissioned officer. Mark said that the NCO made a racist comment to him as they passed each other in the hall. which led Mark to then start a fight with him. Mark and this NCO had to go to a disciplinary hearing. They agreed to go their separate ways, and neither of them received any discipline for the fight. Mark was constantly receiving even more harassment after this fight. He was also now being intimidated by the white personnel that outranked him. 2 months after the altercation with his NCO, Mark Essex went AWOL from the Navy. Mark called his mother and told her that he was coming home because he couldn't stand all the racism in the Navy. While he was at home, Mark told his parents about everything that happened. He also expressed to his parents the growing hatred that he had towards white people. Mark's parents attempted to reason with him, but it didn't really work. He was pretty radicalized at this point, and there was really nothing that was going to stop him. Mark's rage was only worsened when he actually returned to the Navy to face his criminal hearing for going AWOL. During the hearing, Mark told all of his superior officers about all the racism that was happening throughout the ranks. Mark's superior and kind of like his lawyer was Lieutenant Hatcher. Lieutenant Hatcher actually provided a pretty good defense for Mark. He told him that he was doing great in all of his work there in the Navy, and that he was enraged by all of the racism that he had been receiving, and he stuck up for Mark. However, the disciplinary panel didn't see it that way. They discharged Mark from the Navy for general unsuitability on February 11th, 1971 at the age of 21. This whole experience in general just fanned the flames for Mark. He was so upset that he got discharged from the Navy, but the Navy didn't do anything about any of the racism that the black personnel were experiencing. After his discharge from the Navy, Mark went to Manhattan and joined a local chapter of the Black Panther Party. Obviously, joining the Black Panther Party, he became even more radicalized and even more entrenched in those thoughts. They introduced him to guerrilla warfare, and Mark studied all of the tactics that went along with it. This soon led to Mark purchasing his first firearm. It was a Ruger 44 caliber carbine rifle. Soon after that, Mark returned home to Emporia, Kansas, where he began to target practice almost non-stop. He would go out to the countryside and shoot at targets. He actually became a very good marksman. After he became an expert with his rifle, he moved to New Orleans. Between 1971 and 1972, Mark actually moved between New Orleans and his home in Kansas about 4 times. He finally decided to settle down in November of 1972 and bought an apartment in New Orleans. During his time in New Orleans, Mark was enrolled into a federal program that allowed him to study vending machine repair. He was also able to enroll in a few African study courses. The African study courses allowed Mark to memorize a few hate slogans in a few different languages. Once he learned all of those hate slogans, he actually wrote them all over the walls in his apartment. During this time, Mark also got his hands on a .38 caliber revolver. He was leading a deeply secluded life at this point and was constantly battling depression. In September of 1972, police from New Orleans announced that they were creating a new program called the Felony Action Squad. This squad was formed to reduce the amount of violent crimes in New Orleans. The police superintendent at that time also announced that any threat to this squad would be met with deadly force. Not necessarily the bringing everybody together stance that you would hope to expect from your police officers. Also, not typically the way you would want to introduce a new program to the community. Hey, by the way, we're implementing this program, and if you don't like it, we're just going to kill you. Sounds a little authoritative there, buddy. On November 16th, 1972, Mark learned that there was a protest at a university in Baton Rouge. During the protest at the Southern University, 2 black students were shot and killed by police officers. Mark was so upset by this that he actually wrote a letter to his mom. The letter said, quote, "I have now decided that the white man is my enemy, and I will fight to gain my manhood or die trying." A couple days before New Year's Eve, Mark wrote a letter to a local TV station in New Orleans. In the letter, he described his intentions to attack the New Orleans police station. He said that the attack would be held on December 31st. He also said the reason for the attack was to seek revenge for the 2 black kids that were killed at Southern University. At approximately 10:55 p.m. on New Year's Eve in 1972, Mark parked his car about a block away from the New Orleans Police Department. He was armed with his rifle and his revolver. He also had a ton of ammunition, firecrackers, a gas mask, wire cutters, lighter fluid, and some matches. They were all being carried inside a green duffel bag. Mark then took a position behind some parked cars right across the street from the jail. While the lights flickered in the dimly lit parking lot, Mark opened fire on some of the officers that were standing outside. As Mark Essex's first shots rang through the air, 19-year-old cadet Bruce Weatherford was walking towards the jail to clock in for the night. As soon as he heard the shots fired, he dove for cover behind a car. As he looked over his shoulder, he saw 19-year-old cadet Alfred Harrell get shot through the chest. After firing 6 rounds, Mark climbed a fence and escaped by crossing a busy highway on foot. While he was running, he lit off several rounds of firecrackers as a diversion. After running across the busy highway, Mark found himself in an industrial park area. While in the industrial park, Mark gained access to one of the buildings. It was the Burkhart Manufacturing Building. Once he was in the building, the alarm triggered 2 police officers to respond. Officer Edwin Hosley Sr. and Harold Blappert were the 2 officers to respond. They circled the building a couple times and didn't know that the alarm was actually part of all of the action that was happening over at the jail. At 11:13 p.m., Officer Hosley exited the vehicle to investigate further. Mark Essex shot him in the back. He then fired a couple more rounds into the police cruiser. His partner, Officer Blappert, still in the vehicle, fired off a few rounds towards Mark. One of the rounds was later found to have wounded Mark. 30 police officers responded to the call at the manufacturing plant that Mark broke into. However, Mark was already gone by the time the officers arrived. They did find a discarded .38 caliber handgun and a bloody handprint. Officer Hosley died of his wounds on March 5th, 1973. Between January 1st and the morning of January 7th, Mark's movements aren't very well known. It is known that he spent a few days inside of a church that he broke into. Police found blood and food wrappers inside the church, as well as a note to the pastor apologizing for the break-in. All of this was found after a neighbor reported suspicious activity inside the church. The caller stated that the person had a bloody hand that was wrapped in cloth. Mark also visited Joe's grocery store located close to the church. The store owner, Joe Pernisario, sold Mark a few things on January 2nd. Mark found out that Joe was the person that called the police and told him that he was staying at the church. On January 7th, around 10:15 a.m., Mark entered Joe's grocery again. He loudly called for Joe. Joe, knowing that he was in trouble, tried to flee the scene. As Joe was trying to get out of the store, Mark shot him with his rifle, severely wounding him. Mark then carjacked a black motorist named Marvin Albert. Mark then drove his newly acquired vehicle to the downtown Howard Johnson Hotel. He parked the vehicle on the 4th level of the parking garage. He finally found an unlocked door on the 18th floor. By this time, several people saw Mark carrying his rifle through the parking garage and called the police. As Mark entered the hotel on the 18th floor, he saw a couple black employees and said, "Don't worry, we're only shooting whites today." Running down the hallway, Mark encountered 28-year-old Dr. Robert Stiegel. Mark raised his rifle at Robert, and Robert lunged at him, knowing that he was about to be shot, so he was going to put up a fight. During the struggle for the gun, Robert was shot through the arm. After Robert was shot in the arm, he stumbled backwards a bit. This gave Mark enough room to raise his rifle and shoot him through the chest, killing him. Robert's wife, Elizabeth, just started screaming because she witnessed her husband being shot. Mark then turned the rifle to her, shot her in the head, and killed her instantly. Mark then went into their room and lit their room on fire using lighter fluid. He then dropped a Pan-Africa flag on the floor. Mark Essex then ran down to the 11th floor and started several other rooms on fire. He then shot and killed the hotel assistant manager, 62-year-old Frank Schneider. He then ran down to the 10th floor where he encountered the general manager of the hotel. General manager Walter Collins was trying to warn guests about the fires being started above them. Mark, not liking that he was trying to help everyone, shot him. Walter Collins died of his injuries on January 26th. Now on the 8th floor, Mark ran into a broadcasting executive, Robert Beamish. Mark shot Robert in the stomach. Robert then fell backwards into a pool. Robert thought he was dead, but after a while he realized he wasn't going to die, but he stayed in the pool for 2 hours before he was rescued. It is now 11:20 a.m. and there are a ton of police officers and firefighters surrounding the building and establishing a command post outside. There were several marksmen deployed at strategic locations around the area as well. A room-by-room search was ordered. Firefighters were trying to rescue guests as the burning flames on the top floors were getting too extreme. Firefighters were trying to save guests that were stranded on their balconies. These rescue attempts were thwarted by Mark as he was pinning them down with gunfire. A 29-year-old firefighter, Timothy Ursing, was trying to rescue a few stranded hotel guests onto a balcony, and Mark was firing on them. Mark hit him through the shoulder. Timothy fell backwards into the arms of a few other police officers that were on the same ladder. The police officers were able to grab him and take him to safety. Timothy survived his gunshot wound, but it would cost him his arm. Back on the ground, paramedics were loading Timothy with the shoulder wound into the ambulance when Mark actually shot the ambulance driver in the back. A few minutes later, a police officer named Charles Arnold was taking a strategic position across the street. With a rifle in hand, Mark Essex spotted him and shot him through the jaw. Arnold was able to wrap his wound and drive himself to a nearby hospital. He would survive his wound. Mark then shot and wounded a 33-year-old police officer named David Munch. David was shot through the leg and the neck. David was also positioned across the street like other officers were. At 11:55 a.m., patrolman Kenneth Solis and David McCann attempted to dispel a crowd of spectators from a plaza north of the hotel. Really? There's a crowd at this point? There's shots going off everywhere and a crowd is gathering. This is like the most bizarre thing I've ever heard. As the two walked from beneath a canopy of trees to reach the crowd of onlookers, Solis was shot in the right shoulder with the bullet exiting beneath his lower rib cage. McCann immediately carried his partner back beneath the tree canopy out of Mark's view. Emmanuel Palmisano ran to his aid, only to be shot in his arm and back. A 26-year-old patrolman named Philip Coleman responded to the cries for help. He drove his patrol car into the plaza. As Coleman rolled out of the driver's seat and opened the rear door to help his fellow patrolman, Mark Essex fatally shot him in the head. Mark now made his way to the 16th floor of the hotel. There he encountered 33-year-old officer Paul Pasego trying to divert hotel guests out of harm's way. Mark spotted him and shot him in the head, killing him. Around 12 p.m., a search party was put together to locate two missing officers that they believed to be in the hotel. While the rescue party was approaching the 16th floor, they heard a whistling sound. They thought it was a police whistle, so they decided to turn the corner, and as soon as they turned the corner, Mark Essex was standing there with his rifle. Mark shot the lead officer through the chest at point-blank range. He then turned and ran. Mark now made his way to the roof of the hotel, barricading himself between some concrete barriers. It was now 2 p.m. and he was running low on ammunition. Above, Mark could hear a military helicopter. The pilot of this military helicopter was later found to have taken the helicopter without permission from the military in order to help. This helicopter began to do strafing runs on the rooftop. In a last-ditch effort, the police sent a black officer up to the rooftop to persuade Mark to surrender. Mark's reply was raising a fist in the air and saying, "Power to the people." Shortly before 9 p.m., after nearly 7 hours of being up on the rooftop, Mark decided to make one last stand. He decided to run out from where he was standing with his rifle at his waist and his fist in the air saying, "Come and get me." As soon as he ran out from where he was hiding, he was immediately met with hundreds of bullets. There were several sharpshooters positioned at locations across the street, as well as other officers that had targets on him. The helicopter was also beginning a new strafing run and decided to open fire on Mark as well. The momentum of all of the bullets propelled Mark's body backwards several feet. The barrage of gunfire would continue for 4 minutes. In the autopsy after the fact, it was found that Mark had over 200 gunshot wounds. This is a bit extreme. It was not a shoot to stop the threat. They kept shooting until there was basically nothing left of him. It's a bit crazy. Further investigation revealed that Mark only had 2 bullets left. so he decided to charge in a symbolic suicide. In both shootings, Mark shot a total of 21 people, killing 9. 7 other officers were injured in the crossfire in the final moments of the gun battle. During the funeral, Mark's parents finally spoke to the media. They told the media that their son killed all of these people because of the discrimination that he faced while in the Navy. In Mark's apartment, there was writing all over the walls depicting racial and revolutionary slogans. Mark had painted the windows and covered them in blankets. The only light source in the whole apartment was from one single red light bulb. Mark also pinned a map of New Orleans onto the wall and circled several locations, one of them being the police station. It was thought that he had planned several other shootings if he would have survived. After the shooting, investigators were looking at all of the evidence. Some investigators are now saying that they believe there was more than one shooter involved because they uncovered more than one type of bullet. Other investigators were less convinced of this because the evidence just wasn't enough to conclude that there was more than one shooter, and no other shooter was found in the hotel. That is my story of Mark Essex, the New Orleans sniper. Please like and comment on this video and subscribe to my page if you want more content like this. As always, thank you for watching. Bye everyone.